Okay, looks like it's recording. You got it?
Got it.
Cool. Okay. Um, I would like to introduce Sabeen Rokerya from Columbia University. She's a graduate student in public health in the Department of Population and Family Health. We're going to be talking today about creating a research question and really dig into your research a little bit and see what the kind of work you do. So welcome, and I thank you for joining me. Would you mind just kind of introducing yourself? I don't want to speak for you, so would you mind introducing yourself, talk about your research for a second?
Sure. As I mentioned, I'm Sabeen Rokerya, and I'm a student right now. I'm currently a graduate student getting my master's of public health. I graduated from undergrad actually in May 2019. So I'm actually still a student, and I'm not too long ago an undergrad student. And I also studied public health while I was an undergrad. So I've been doing kind of public health research for a couple years in a student capacity as a research assistant and studying different things within public health. As a graduate student, my research now focuses primarily on forced migration issues and things related to displacement, particularly related to complex emergencies. So generally when we think of crises, we think of refugees, we think of refugee camps, we think of war, we think of conflict. A lot of people are moving as a result of those things. And so those are the kinds of things that I study, and I study the relationship between that migration and people's health. I'm personally really interested in studying maternal health and how that relates to, and how migration issues relate to people's outcomes when they are giving birth and they're having infants and they're having children.
Hmm.
So that's what I'm doing now. I am supporting some research within the capacity of my program as a research assistant. So I can talk a little bit about some of the introductory level research that we've been doing.
Yeah, definitely. I would love to dig into your interests. I mean, so for me, and tell me if this is a different path for you, but for me, I always feel like a good research program and a good line of research follows from one's own personal interest. And so I would like to hear your thoughts on how did you get interested in this particular area of research?
Sure. So I didn't study any migration or anything like that while I was an undergrad. I went to Rutgers University, and so as a public health student there, I was studying public health at a very basic, general public institution level situation. There was so much going on, so I was kind of getting exposure to a lot of different things. Um, Through that, I did have one minor experience, not minor, but it was a smaller experience that I did for about 2 weeks where I shadowed a bunch of doulas in my area.
Oh,
And so I started to learn about maternal health through them. Um, and so that's kind of like my first introductory level to some of this research. And then when I came to graduate school was really when I had the opportunity to specialize. And I've been thinking about immigration for a really long time. I am a first generation American. My parents are immigrants. So it is a really personal experience. But with that, it also is something that there's so much that I haven't experienced within it, but I still care so deeply about. So I do agree that our research interests are generally sometimes very amplified, and um, we can be really effective in certain areas when we have a certain personal connection to them or a certain interest in them. For some people, it's that they've had exposure or they lived in communities where they've seen certain things happen, particularly when it comes to social science. A lot of us are growing up with people that are experiencing certain things, even if we're not experiencing them ourselves. Um, and I think that that can really impact how we think about our research going forward, whether or not it's personal or something that we saw.
yeah, yeah. Thank you for sharing. And just so students who aren't familiar, what is a doula?
A doula is a non-clinical individual who supports someone who is either about to be pregnant, or has just delivered a child in all of that, in the process of giving birth and in the process of everything that comes before and after birth. They provide generally relational support. They usually become really good friends with the person who is delivering a baby, and provide support in terms of lactation and just making sure that the person who is about to give birth is really comfortable in the environment. Specifically in the US, there's a lot of support that doulas provide to people who are about to give birth in hospitals, just to make sure that people fully understand the medical process and helping them
Mhm.
advocate for themselves when they're communicating with their doctors.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, and I definitely agree with with that sentiment of having some relationship to the work. So I study whiteness, and given that this class is more of an online class, the students are going to get to hear me talk about my whiteness research nearly as much as they would in this online forum, or as in an in-person forum. But for me, just to share a little bit too, I grew up in a really poor community in Southern California, and experienced firsthand what institutional racism looks like. Even though I'm a white person, right? I lived in a primarily Latinx community, and so living those experiences has really informed the way that I look at my research, right? And I think that's important to think about for sure. Um, and for you, so to turn back over to you, what is the problem you're trying to address with your research?
So, a little bit more specific about my research right now, I am studying the concept of uncertainty among immigrants and among migrant populations in a few different areas where there are a lot of people who may identify as people who are immigrating. So, uncertainty is obviously a vague concept. When you think of uncertainty, it's what does that mean? Does it mean you're just unsure? Does it mean you feel fear? Does it mean you feel something else? So, in the process of trying to measure that, we are trying to develop a research question to be able to create a measurement tool to measure uncertainty among people who might be migrating. So we are in the really early stages, but for me, I think measuring uncertainty is a really important indicator of a lot of the outcomes that we see in people's health, especially in immigrant populations. For example, if you're just talking about the US, uncertainty can mean so many different things, but for people who are uncertain about health insurance, that directly impacts their ability to have positive health outcomes in so many different ways, whether or not they're giving birth or whether or not they're trying to seek care for a chronic illness. Uncertainty can take many different forms, but I think it has a very definable impact on immigrant communities in different places, including the US.
Hmm. And how are you all thinking about that particular construct and the measurement of it? And I guess what I mean by that is, as you're kind of going through this path of measuring it, and obviously we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves here a little bit, but how do you is measuring something like uncertainty, is that a kind of a psychological construct? Is that a relational construct? Is it so? How would you think about that?
Exactly that way. We think about what different areas or fields or subjects that construct may fit into. So, for example, one of the first things that we've started to look into is mental health and psychology and psychiatry, and how uncertainty and maybe some of its synonyms or proxy terms might fit into a pathway already defined by the psychological health or mental health community.
Hmm.
We were thinking about stress and how that might relate to uncertainty. And we know that there's a lot of literature and research that happens on stress within the mental health research community. We also are thinking about um, frameworks that are defined by medical anthropology, by sociology. So we're starting to look at different fields that might already have some kind of understanding of either the word uncertainty or something that might be similar or adjacent to the term uncertainty, such as stress. Um, Sometimes it can be intolerance or tolerance. Sometimes it can mean confusion. So anything that we're kind of thinking about is related, we're going into specific fields to see what work they've already done in those areas.
Oh, that's cool. So why not? So if I'm new to research, I might ask the question of, why not just use something that's already been done? Why not use a measure of like stress, for example?
Well, I think because there is a little bit of a distinction that we feel there is between uncertainty and stress. I think that people have who don't have uncertainty and who are certain about certain things can still be stressed. But aside from that as well, I think when we look at stress pathways and we look at structural frameworks that talk about how stress can be measured, Sometimes it's a little bit more biological than what we're looking for.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's a little bit more um, rigid with good purpose than what we're looking for. We are trying to understand a little bit more of that, I guess, still not well defined, vague layer of how the feeling of uncertainty might affect someone's health, not necessarily um, the very rigid definition of whether or not a person is in fact uncertain or certain about something.
Hmm.
Um, I think that even if you have certainty about something, you can still feel uncertain, and that can impact your behavior and your health outcomes. So I
Mm,
think that's kind of where we differ from some of what other fields, particular. I'm talking about psychology and psychiatry more specifically right now because they seem to have done a lot of work on this and have specific measurement tools for stress. So I think that's that kind of extra added layer of understanding that we're trying to have that psychology, psychiatry, mental health hasn't really tapped into based on what we've seen.
yeah, definitely. And you get to something really interesting bringing up psychology. So I'm a psychologist by training, right? And so even within the subfields of psychology, there are different measures of stress, right? So a community psychologist like myself might measure stress in a survey and ask, um, use the Likert scale in a survey and ask various questions around stressful events or something like that. Whereas perhaps a neuropsychologist or clinical psychologist might use something like dopamine as an indicator of stress or some other brain chemical, right? So it's kind of an interesting sort of nuance that you're tapping into that I just wanted to highlight there. Um, so it sounds like, and I'm kind of thinking about how you walk through creating, so sort of getting to a research question then, and let's try to tap down into that. So it sounds like where you're at currently, or where we're at currently in this conversation, is you've talked about structuring or not structuring, but really conceptualizing your construct, right? By looking at the literature, seeing what other fields have done, seeing what's similar, identifying, really trying to parse down that clear definition of what you're trying to get into. I'm trying to paraphrase here. Am I correct there?
Right, absolutely.
Okay, great. And so can you talk about then moving from there to your specific process and creating what you perceive as a good research question?
Absolutely. So that's the exact process that I am in right now with my team. We are defining that construct on how we kind of want to look into it and then figuring out, well, how are we going to actually ask this question for a study and what are we even trying to understand? So I think one of the things that we've really spent a lot of time on is defining our population. Who are we actually talking about? Who are the immigrants with whom we are trying to understand their uncertainty? So that means that we pick specific populations. So we could talk about immigrants in the United States. Okay, well, that's a lot of people. What do you mean by that? Getting a little bit more specific. Um, Understanding what type of immigrant. Are they an immigrant if they um, have been living here for a long time and have gone through maybe some timeline of assimilation, or are they an immigrant if they just got here? Defining what immigrant means in our study is something that I think is um, one of the most preliminary crucial steps. And then also, whether or not you're in the States, defining all of the certain things that help specify your population, who, how, what region are you limiting to, what age group are you limiting to, what are you including anything about legal status? Are you like, what's the thought process on that? And then also thinking about a timeline. When and how are we going to think about doing this study? All of those questions, the who and the when and the how, really can only be answered by us defining what the design of our study is and how we're actually going to execute it. So we figure out who we're trying to think about, we figure out how we want to get to them, we figure out when we want to get to them. And then we figure out, well, how are we going to determine what their uncertainty is? Are we going to look for data that's already been published by other researchers that have maybe conducted interviews or things like that? Are we going to be looking for data that just points us in the direction of uncertainty, such as quantitative data about things that we think fit into uncertainty? like um, government disclosure of who is insured and who isn't, or government disclosure of XYZ, other things that we define as people being uncertain? Or are we going to conduct interviews ourselves with participants and talk to them about their uncertainty about their health and uncertainty about certain things? Um, Once we decide how we actually want to get that information, then we're able to specialize even more and specify even more who, what, when, where, how.
Mm. That's cool. So you are, and I'm totally nerding out on what you're saying here, because what you're doing is you're kind of walking me through this process of you're thinking about your sample, you're thinking about your sampling frame, you're thinking about the research design and even data collection method that you want to use, or perhaps you think is best for this particular area of research. And so it's kind of interesting because, in a lot of what I see in a lot of textbooks and a lot of the ways that a research methods class is taught is that you sort of have this linear fashion of, okay, we have a topic, then we create a research question, then we create the design, then we create the sample, right? And the research question goes first, but in a lot of ways, you're kind of flipping that on its head, right? Which I think is really incredible, because that's the way it actually works, right?
Yeah.
Versus, um, versus the way that it's taught, right? And that's part of why I love having these conversations, is because students can kind of hear from you about the ways that it actually occurs versus the way the textbook says it's done, right? Which is cool. So I want to tap into something that you said for here for a second, and you talked about really kind of, I'll say, shrinking down your population. I don't mean that as a pejorative, but really clearly defining the boundaries of who is sort of included and excluded from your definition of immigrant or your population. And so I might ask, if I'm new to research, of why not just, let's say, all immigrants in the United States?
Well, I think the first question that comes to our mind is, well, if we want to conduct our own interviews, for example, well, first we figure out how we want to get that information. Based on what's available to us, that can kind of help us understand what's actually feasible. So my first thought when you mention that is feasibility.
Mm,
We are not always able to create a sampling or to use a sampling frame that is quote unquote everybody. There also is the potential of bias when we are including too many people and too many different types of groups and too wide of a sampling frame in something that we're trying to answer. It can usually also, I don't want to say usually, but it can also create kind of fuzzy data, because if you're keeping your definition of immigrant really broad, it can kind of change and add nuances to what you're trying to figure out. Um, and I think that's also what you mentioned is really correct, that our research question is developing as we kind of figure these things out. It's not really as simple as like our research question is completely well defined to start and then it stays the same and then we kind of just fill in the blanks. Our research question changes per what's feasible, what type of money we have, what region we're in, and what we're able to do. And I think including almost everybody with that isn't always really feasible. Um, I'm forgetting another point that I had, but I'm really just thinking about, I was talking about nuance. So if we're including all of these different identities, sometimes it can kind of either hit or miss our research question that we've started to define. And over time, as our research question does become more defined, so do the types of people that we're including, and so do um, the regions that we're reaching out to and the means that we're using. I'm not sure if that was a really effective answer, but I think my first thought would be feasibility. It's not really always possible to sample and interview everybody that might potentially fit into our sampling frame.
right. Yeah, and to try to paraphrase here, what I'm hearing you getting at is, if so I asked the question of why not all immigrants in the U.S. And so if that's the case, right, we're talking about literally millions and millions of people.
Yeah.
And so what I'm hearing you say is, and I like the fuzzy data piece, because if you're including millions of people, the feasibility of actually being able to quote unquote randomly sample, if that's your sampling method, is going to, that's not possible. That's just not feasibly possible to do that, right? And so what that can create is skewed biased data, as you mentioned. And so that's what I'm hearing from you. And I feel like that's super insightful, because we often don't consider that area of feasibility. I feel like a lot of researchers might consider the sort of monetary piece of the feasibility, not necessarily the skewness of the data piece of feasibility, right?
Right. And I would also add that, in thinking about it a little bit more, for example, if we were to pick a method of research that had us use, let's say we did pick a sampling frame that was the entire immigrant population in the US, which is millions and millions of people, and we agreed that we couldn't interview every single person and we couldn't do focus groups with that many people. It just wasn't feasible for us to even physically do that. We don't have the staff, we don't have the means. Let's say we were going to pull some kind of already registered data from a US based registry, that would kind of give us that information on that scale of thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of people. And then we just have all of that data in an Excel sheet. One of the things I think about when we're pulling data like that that's available per registry is, who are we missing?
Mm,
Are the people that are included in this data the people that we are trying to hone in on and focus on? It might include some of them, it might include more than what we're looking for, it might include absolutely none of the people that we're looking for based on however that data was collected originally. So, for example, census data, 2020 census, I encourage everybody to fill it out. Um, Census data is a really great resource, but there's tons of people that don't fill out the census for a lot of different reasons. And one of the first things that comes to mind when I think about immigrant research is the amount of people that don't fill it out because they either don't have access to it, because of language barriers, or they don't have a permanent resident for it to be mailed out to, or they don't really just have the time or the will or even the lack of fear not to fill it out. So I think when you're talking about something like immigrant populations, there's so many other things that we have to think of before we just say, let's just do everybody and we have the data for it. We have to kind of think about the biases and the lack of coverage that might come from too big of a sampling frame or too little of a sampling frame.
mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I often tell my students that part of this type of science is there's a lot of art and a lot of creativity in conducting this type of work, right? Which again, kind of leaning back on the textbook example of the way that research is quote unquote supposed to be conducted is it's not conducted that way just because it can't be, right? It's way too cookie cutter. It's not necessarily a recipe, um, in that sort of way, right? Yeah, I appreciate this. So I do want to be respectful of your time. We've had about a half an hour so far. So two final questions here. One, is there anything that I'm missing that you'd like to give to the students? And then two, what advice would you give to a group of potential future researchers?
I don't know if we're missing anything. I think the take home point that you've mentioned a few times, definitely, I am a student right now and I take a lot of classes on research design and how to create research questions and how to do surveys and how to conduct research, especially in public health. And I am side by side fortunate enough to see that process unfold. And so I really do understand um, the difference and the discrepancy between the way that we are taught and also the way that it does actually unfold. But I do think that that textbook definition does really create a really good standard for us to even start thinking about research. And I do think that best practices do come out of often sticking as much as possible rigidly to creating a well-defined research question and then moving from there, and all of the things that fall under that. But it is real that research is really confusing at times, and certain things can be out of order, which is also what makes it that art that you were talking about. And I think in thinking about this advice that I would give to researchers, I'm still learning a lot, but one of the things that I really started to think about, especially in public health, is the role of community in research and community-based participatory research, which is actually, um, I think, almost now a textbook term, but really just understanding that as the role of research, as having the role of researchers, we have a lot of privilege, we have a lot of um, power in the decisions that we make, especially when we're working with people. And social science research is very much with people a lot of the time. So I really encourage all students that are thinking about research to start thinking about whether if they want to do research with people, to think about what types of communities would be receptive to partnering on research, so that we aren't just researchers going into communities and sampling them, surveying them, taking the results and publishing them for our own benefit. I feel very strongly about that, and I really like to open up that conversation with my peers and colleagues and professors, and I think it's a really great thing that we could start to explore.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate you bringing that up because that's also something that I'm, well, one, trained in as a community psychologist, but also think about deeply. And I think that's super important to build those strong relationships with communities. And I do want to touch on something because I don't want to misinform the students. So I do think a textbook is good, and I don't want to throw out the textbook by any means. And the way that I think about it is, the textbook is, or a textbook is kind of like a recipe book, right? And I see it kind of as a recipe book. And so if I'm a new chef, i.e. researcher, if I'm a new chef, I can look at that textbook and really follow the recipe to make a good, cookie or whatever, right? But then once I start becoming more of a master chef and more seasoned, then I don't necessarily need the cookbook. Or if I use the cookbook, I can throw in my own spices and my own flavors to kind of make it my own, right? And that's kind of how I see it. I'm using my own analogy here, but I appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. I completely agree.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Any advice? I mean, you talked about the community stuff. Any other advice you'd like to give a group of future researchers?
Well, I think, I mean, what's been on my mind in general right now has generally just been the COVID-19 response. And so
Mhm.
I encourage any students generally that are thinking about research to start thinking about um, public health. I mean, I don't know, that's like a shameless plug, but
Okay.
I really, I really think public health is a gift, and I think it's more important than ever. And so I think all fields are very important, and the research is collaborative. I'm using research from other fields as well, but I really think that we could use all the help that we could get right now. So if anybody is questioning public health, dive deep into it. We'd love to have you.
That's great. Thank you so much. Yeah, and I do appreciate public health for sure. And just a note for the students, this was recorded on March 27th, 2020, right smack in the middle of this coronavirus outbreak. And so we're in our mutual homes across the country from each other and recording this interview. So, well, great. Well, Sabeen, I really appreciate your time. And if it's okay with you, I'm going to go ahead and hit the stop button here.
Great, thank you. Take care.
All right. Thank you.